Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Investigative Journalism in an Age of Autocracy. I'm Chris Oppie, Director of the Ellsberg Initiative for Peace and Democracy at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, where I'm also a professor of history. I want to begin by thanking the Chancellor's Community, Democracy, and Dialogue Initiative for funding tonight's event. I also want to announce an upcoming event. Next Wednesday night, November 19th at 7 p.m., we'll have the fourth annual Ellsberg Lecture featuring acclaimed journalist and radio host Farai Chidea, who will examine the perilous state of American democracy as the nation approaches its 250th anniversary. The event will be held on the UMass campus at the Integrative Learning Center, room S211. We'll put up a link in the chat with more details about that event. So I'm very excited by tonight's panel of young investigative journalists. They will no doubt give some attention to the current relationship between the government and the media and how this administration has sought to demonize, intimidate, silence, sue, and even extort the media. With that in mind, it may be worth recalling a key moment of media defiance that came 54 years ago with the publication of the Pentagon Papers, a top secret history of US decision-making in Vietnam that was released to the press and public in 1971 by Daniel Ellsberg. The Nixon administration took unprecedented measures in an effort to prevent the media from publishing the Pentagon Papers. For the first time in US history, the Nixon government issued prior restraint injunctions ordering the New York Times and the Washington Post from continuing their series of articles on the classified history that exposed 2 decades of government lies about the causes and conduct of the Vietnam War. But the amazing thing is that while the injunctions against the Times and the Post were working their way through the legal system, Ellsberg and some of his supporters got parts of the Pentagon Papers to 17 other newspapers, and they all ran stories. It was an instance of massive media defiance of the government and was, in effect, an act of collective civil disobedience by the press. They defied Nixon even before the Supreme Court ruled in support of their right to publish the papers. My point is that we do have some striking historical examples of the media playing an important role in the preservation of democracy and First Amendment rights. And thankfully, we've always had intrepid individual reporters who have risked a great deal to expose wrongdoing and defend democracy. Tonight's panelists are among them. So now I will briefly introduce them. Shawn Musgrave is a media law attorney and reporter who is now the newsroom counsel for Versant Media. Alexander Sammon is a features writer at Slate. Gaby del Valle is a policy reporter at The Verge. Jasper Craven is a freelance reporter who has written for numerous outlets, including The Intercept, The New Republic, and The New York Times. He will also serve as tonight's moderator. So I will now turn it over to Jasper.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thanks everybody for being here tonight. We really appreciate it. I'm really excited for this discussion. Before we get going, I just want to give everybody the chance to offer a bit more background on who they are, what sorts of topics they cover, that sort of stuff to sort of help prime you all for the discussion we're about to have. So, as Chris said, my name is Jasper Craven. I have been a freelance reporter for about a decade now. Actually became a freelancer right as the first Trump administration was kicking off, and have been writing for a number of outlets ever since. I mostly cover the military and veterans issues, and also sort of like the mutant militia masculinity world that is sort of morphing out of that, how it influences politics, culture, and society. So why don't we go with you next, Shawn?
Sure. Thanks, Jasper, and thanks so much to Ellsberg Center for having us. This is going to be a fun discussion, I think. So I until recently I was at The Intercept as in a hybrid role as a reporter and a lawyer. Now I'm just firmly in the lawyer chair at Versant Media, but that kind of speaks to my background and a lot of the things that I've covered over the years. After starting as an investigative reporter for several years, I went to law school to work on media law, including as kind of part of the so-called Trump bump that went to law school around the time that of his first election. Um, and then now I'm living that day to day. As far as what I covered while I was at the Intercept, usually had some sort of connection to the legal system, either on the criminal side or on the civil side, and increasingly since January, a lot of the lawsuits that have been filed against the Trump administration's various actions, including in the First Amendment space.
Alrighty, Gabby.
Okay, my turn. Yeah, thank you all for being here, and thank you to the Ellsberg Center and to Jasper for moderating. I also started my journalism career during the first Trump administration, and I wanted to be a lawyer. Actually, I wanted to be an immigration lawyer, and instead I became an immigration reporter, or tried to. And I remember being told very early on in my career that I was lucky that Trump was president because otherwise nobody would care about immigration, which uh, unfortunately I think is kind of borne out to be true. But it's something I've been pushing back against basically since 2016. So I cover immigration, and through covering immigration, I also started covering, or several years ago, started covering the far right, because I was like, well, who's pushing all of these restrictive immigration policies? And it's a very specific contingent of the nativist right. So right now I'm at The Verge, covering the Department of Homeland Security, privacy, surveillance, immigration, and a bunch of other things. And I'm also, I guess right now I'm not at The Verge. Right now I'm on book leave from The Verge. Thank you to my editors for letting me take book leave. And I'm writing a book about immigration restriction, conservation, and eugenics at the turn of the 20th century, and finding that a lot of that relates to the present day. Yeah.
Wonderful. Alex.
Cool. Hey, yeah, thanks to everyone for putting this together. This is very cool. And I'm excited to be sharing the screen with you guys. So I work at Slate. I'm a features writer at Slate. I for a number of years have covered politics. I'm doing that a little less now, and I think for like the last um I don't know, year or so, I guess since Trump 2 started, I've been doing a lot of stuff about ICE recently. So I've done some stuff on ICE detention centers and also some recent stuff on ICE in the field. And I think, I mean, there's a lot of overlap there probably with Gaby and but I think that it sort of goes in a lot of different directions and seeing sort of like where this vision of governance is going and the sort of crackdowns on First Amendment stuff. Obviously, a lot of that's come out of ICE as well, and they've used immigration policy as really like an anti-First Amendment cudgel. And anyways, that's really not part of the intro. Anyways, yeah, so I don't know. I do features for Slate. That's sort of it. And yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Wonderful. I guess, as I look at this group gathered today, myself included, I realize that most of the people I'm close with and most of the work I read actually, these days is most of the most interesting work really is occurring in smaller outlets, not necessarily the New York Times or the Washington Post. I think those big legacy media institutions still do a pretty good job about sort of like creating a shared information space and often is actually sort of like instigating other reporters and sort of like follow up and new angles out of that work. Like I don't want to diminish the work that the Times or the Post does to just put out like well-sourced, solid information much of the time, almost all of the time. But and reporters for those outlets have cachet, they have access, they have huge audiences. Like in some ways, I think all of us at some point or another have dreamed about working for these places. Um, And yet I also think that there are certain like restrictions to working in an environment like that, working at an outlet like that, whether it's just like simple space restrictions, style, needing to work within like a very large bureaucracy, catering to a specific audience, all of these sorts of things. And so I actually have sort of come to see my own career as a freelancer as really freeing and um, I feel like a lot of people writing in this sort of like second tier in size outlets doing some of the more interesting work right now. And I guess I want to ask each of you how you sort of see your sort of role in the media ecosystem. What stories maybe like you have had challenges covering because of media issues around access or sort of like other things and sort of how you've used your perch to cover the administration in interesting ways. So I maybe we'll just sort of keep with the same order, and Shawn, you can go first.
Sure. So a big part of my work, both now and at The Intercept, was around helping, both for my own reporting and for other reporters, helping them get access to government records through the Freedom of Information Act at the federal level and different state public records laws. And so, I mean, that was a big part of, or a big part of the kind of glaring question for myself and for other media lawyers and the reporters we work with is like, is FOIA going to continue to be a viable way of extracting information out of this administration? And that's where I think kind of the reporters at the Times, at CNN, at the bigger outlets kind of feed a lot of the a lot of the work cycles that I go through, which is kind of big story will come out that's based on insider information, a leak, or a curated statement from the White House, whatever, and then that feeds kind of the FOIA work. But kind of one of the again, like I said, open questions and kind of what the media lawyers are talking about is like, is it worth continuing to like to try to throw that particular type of spaghetti at the wall if the either during the because of the shutdown or just because of the administration not really caring about formalities like legal obligations under the Freedom of Information Act, is so I mean TBD there. 11 months into Trump 2, I don't have the answer to that, but that's kind of how I'd see the relationship between the bigger outlets and kind of the broader ecosystems. Kind of like you said, the initial information point, a lot of times they'll get they'll often be the ones with the breaking story that then other people can get a piece of, including by using tools like FOIA.
Whoops, sorry, I was muted. A quick follow-up, Shawn. I wonder how you see the sort of like slowly shifting way in which the Supreme Court is being covered. For like decades, basically, there were just sort of scribes there to cover the announcements. There wasn't much digging into the dynamics behind the scenes, what was fueling the decisions, the sort of interpersonal dynamics, the money fueling the whole enterprise. It seems like really in the last, I mean, just a few weeks ago, the Times formally sicked Jodi Kantor, the famous Me Too reporter, the Harvey Weinstein reporter at the Times, onto the Supreme Court. But it seems like there's sort of been a newfound willingness among people in legacy media to sort of like do away with the decorum and sort of more aggressively follow the money. And I know you've done some of that work too, sort of looking at how money influences the court. So can you just touch on that really quickly?
Yeah, I mean, it's been fascinating to watch it also as somebody who like went to law school not so long ago, and kind of watch that shift. Like, so I was in law school during Trump 1, so I didn't actually cover the administration until January. But it's been fascinating to watch kind of a parallel shift in talking about the court within kind of academia and kind of coverage, like you've talked about. Is that, I mean, plenty of my professors, I mean, especially the more conservative ones in law school, would still kind of talk about the Supreme Court in kind of with this assumption that politics or the personal preferences of the individual justices had virtually nothing to do with their rulings. We were just kind of focused on like the text of the opinion and maybe like note kind of individual ideological trends across like how different justices ruled in things, even folks like Scalia who wrote some of the most bombastic rulings of kind of really ushered in a lot of the much of the legal moment that we're now in. So I've watched this happen in both the legal in the legal commentariat as well as the media, and it has been fascinating. I mean, I was just at a conference a couple weeks ago where I guess we were technically under Chatham, so never mind. I shouldn't talk about that one. Anyway, it has been fascinating to watch. I hope it continues because these are some of the most powerful people in our democracy under a constitution that's virtually impossible to amend. So I hope that every outlet puts the type of resources that the Times is, and that this develops into the kind of rigorous beat that we've given to presidents since Nixon.
Cool. Gaby, talk a little bit about how you sort of carve out your beat within the larger immigration landscape.
Yeah, so this year I haven't done a ton of immigration reporting. I did do some reporting from Columbia University about the kind of immigration enforcement, First Amendment crackdown nexus. But I'm gonna actually not talk about immigration reporting. I'm gonna talk
That's
about
okay.
reporting on the right. Um, and I'll say that where the Times and the Post have, and like the Journal have, like access, and deep sourcing, and they get leaks. Like I don't have those things. But because I mostly do or largely do like kind of first person magazine features stuff, I have something else, which is like I'm allowed to have opinions and experiences and put them in print. So I think that is like I think the key differentiating factor for me. Like every time I go to a right-wing conference, it's like I specifically am at this conference and like this is my experience at the conference, and I'm allowed to like historicize it as much as I want. I'm allowed to go off on strange tangents as long as they relate to a point. Um, and it's just because of the differences in style, I think it allows me to paint uh I don't want to say more vivid picture of what's going on, but like if, the Times reports on like suddenly like the White House staff is full of groypers, like they have to kind of go through all of these layers of sourcing. Whereas I'm like, I smoked a cigarette outside of Butterworth's with these like 22-year-old White House staffers who kept saying slurs, which is not exactly what happened, but like something to that effect, basically. And so I think that is a big part of it. Also, this didn't happen all during the Trump administration, but I did a story for The Verge on immigration surveillance technology that required me to spend 42 days with CBP in Tucson, like outside of Tucson, Arizona. And only after my 48 hours with CBP, like when I was like Googling, I don't know, predator drones and how CBP uses them, I realized that the exact same tour that I got, like all the sites, all the stops, they gave to somebody at CNN, like beat for beat the same thing. Um, and I think this was kind of another, except for actually, no, they let the CNN guy ride in the helicopter and they didn't take me in the helicopter, which I was really sad about. But I think like writing for, I guess, like smaller outlets that let you be voicier, I think is kind of a big opportunity in a lot of ways and not necessarily a hindrance, if that makes sense. Because you're just allowed to infuse more, I don't want to say of yourself into it, but like of the world that you know to be true, if that makes sense. Yeah, I don't know.
Wonderful. Alex?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Actually, it's a very interesting point of conversation because I think for one thing that I've found, like reporting on ICE and DHS this year, is like more than anything, ICE will just lie to you in crazy ways. Like they used to be obviously, like if you're doing combative reporting, that like a government agency doesn't really want you to do, like they'll give you the runaround or they'll give you like a quote that's, opaque. Like they can make like life difficult for you. this is like a very new flourish where they'll just like lie about things whole cloth, and they'll tell you things that are just patently false, and like, and they're doing it even in court, right? It's not even just that they're like going to email you a statement that says something. They're going to tell you up is down, but they're going into court and they're doing that too, and which is really interesting as they crack down on protesters and all this stuff, which we really haven't seen any of that. And I think it's interesting because at some level, because I assume that like at these bigger media outlets, like, you have relationships with these departments, you have to, you print what they say, and like you can, it's not like you're doing stenography, but like, it's a different sort of thing. Whereas like when I'm doing my like one-off stuff, it's like I'll email ICE and and ask for access. Like I'll ask for a comment, I'll ask for whatever, but I am not, duty bound by this like ongoing relationship. So it's just a different orientation to the whole thing. And given how it's changed, that actually is really, I think, has been helpful for me. And like, um, yeah, I don't know. That's it's like hard to remember exactly like what has changed in this Trump administration versus the previous one. That to me is like a crazy thing where they're just totally happy to lie to you in like flagrant fashion. And then the other thing I think is interesting, which is a little less about exactly this sort of prompt about different sizes of these media operations, but something I've also noticed in my reporting of late is that like DHS like is making its own content. Like DHS has its own media operation effectively, and that's something we've never seen either. And so like when they're doing these raids in various places like Chicago lately, but also early on in New York City and the Bronx, they were doing this. Like they're bringing their own camera crews, they're shooting their own footage, they're making sizzle reels, like they're making content, and like um a lot of interesting stuff has come out of that. But like, the fact that the government is also in the game at some level, of like of producing, media, is a really weird flourish of this moment. And like, I've heard like a million funny stories about this stuff. I mean, some of it's like really dire and some of it's funny, but one of the big, like the first giant raid that it was done by actually Border Patrol in Kern County in California. It was before Trump was sworn in, led by Greg Bovino, which is a person that I'm sure a lot of people on this call are familiar with. But it was like his tryout for the Trump administration. Effectively, was like he ran all these Border Patrol guys up to Kern County, and they did this giant sort of like shock and awe raid. Um, and they brought their own camera crew to do it. And part of the reason it wasn't that successful is because some of the people got tipped off because the camera crew mentioned that they had been contracted. These are like freelance, videographers and stuff. They mentioned that they had been contracted by CBP to do a job, and like word got out, and so some people were able to like to lay low and get out of harm's way. And that was just because like the camera crew had like loose lips, which is very interesting, I think. Anyways, all that goes to say, it's a really weird media environment, and it's very different than it was even the first Trump administration. And yeah, I think it's like a pretty fascinating development.
Yeah, I just want to stay on this discussion for another moment and sort of invoke the sort of like buzzword I think of the first Trump administration when it came to media was impact. Like if you could make an impact with your work, you could get a grant, you would get vaunted, you would get awards. Like this was sort of, if like the public on the left sort of took up the resistance, impact was what, you know, journalists at most major media companies were really fixated on. And it did feel in that first term that, you know, that outlets could make like significant impact. I mean, I'm trying to understand, I guess, like why the Trump administration capitulated so much back then and why it feels like they're not really at all now. Obviously, Trump has like fully captured the party in a way he hadn't in his first term. Um, I don't know things, and it's like sometimes there is impact. Like I, for one, was surprised when that recent Politico leak of all the young Republicans like being racist caused such a brouhaha in Washington just because you know, like blatant bigotry and uh, prejudice is sort of like running rampant through the party. It just didn't seem like that crazy an example within the sort of broader context, and yet, officials stepped down, people, the Young Republicans of New York chapter was shuttered. So like you still see some examples of impact in the second administration, but not nearly as much, I don't think. And so I guess if you guys could talk a little bit about how you think of impact, whether you think that was always sort of like uh, a false sort of like mission that wasn't actually, I mean, it's like Trump would sort of like cycle out people who had bad records or scandal and like still sort of drive towards the same mission, I think, in his first term, even if he was sort of like responding more reflexively to the media. So if you could all just talk a little bit about that, that would be wonderful. Shawn?
Gabby, go ahead. I'm forming my thought
was
on
gonna
it.
say, I have a vague and kind of grim theory about why there's not really impact anymore, and it's that nothing matters and the Constitution is kind of done. And I often think about when all of those New York prosecutors resigned over like the Eric Adams kind of maybe quid pro quo thing, and like all of the prosecutors who resigned were like Federalist Society true believer conservative prosecutors. They were not like the resistance, and they still like they were people who had been recently sworn in, recently appointed by Trump. And they were like, oh, this is extremely illegal. Like, I cannot do this because I'm an attorney. And I think the difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2 is that January 6th kind of purged all of the like remaining elements of the conservative establishment from the Trump orbit. And then, I mean, last year at CPAC, I don't know if it happened this year too, because I wasn't really paying attention this year. There was a concurrent conference called Principles First, which was kind of like the conservative post J6 defector establishment trying to like regain the mantle or reclaim the mantle of conservatism, and they lost it. So I think that's kind of why we're not seeing impact in the way that we were seeing before. And also they've had like 4 years to kind of like re-strategize, like how do we deal with legal challenges? Like how do we deal with these things? What do we do if the courts tell us we're not allowed to do something? As JD Vance said on a podcast in 2022, you just keep doing what you want to do. You're like, who's going to stop me? And as to the reason why the young Republicans thing actually led to something, I think that's because it was because of infighting within like different conservative factions. And so it's not so much anymore that like you can stop them, I guess, if that's what you're going for, by like appealing to law or appealing to reason. It's just like these people don't like each other. And so if you get like conservative subgroup A to give you dirt on conservative subgroup B, like that actually like leads to things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, super helpful. Yeah, Shawn, I'm interested in your thoughts on how the legal system plays into this, actually.
Yeah, and actually before because the on but not to keep dragging us back to the New York Republicans, but I do think that's actually a really good example to look at the dynamics around, and I think that like political, especially some of the like political scientists who do a lot on like online communities are going to have just the PhDs will be written about that incident. But I think what is fascinating about it is that the one of the only people or one of the people who face the most repercussions for their participation in that chat, Paul Ingracia, who's the nominee to head up the Office of Special Counsel, which is an immensely important legal position that basically oversees whistleblowing for the entire federal government. He's a 30-year-old, maybe he's 31 now, um, uh, even fresher out of law school than I am. And people wrote so many other stories about everything that he had done. He had a despicable Substack. He had aligned himself with plenty of unsavory characters up to this point, such that the fact of his participation in that chat fit a much longer narrative of coverage, but only this one was the one that actually led to him being taken off the board. So I think Gaby really hit it with like that there are still so many other dynamics at play, pettiness, infighting, people just not liking each other, and also just certain things kind of, even though the Overton window has shifted, certain things perhaps at least as they fit within those other dynamics are still kind of uh uh beyond the pale, particularly I think like the affiliation with Nazis. So there's that. Sorry. And then, well, in terms of the role of the legal system, I think one of the lessons that uh, the Trump administration took, or that Trump and the lawyers he still has with him, from the past few years, is that the law can be what he decides, if we kind of rely on the formal mechanisms, that if he just hammers it, if he changes the composition of the Supreme Court, then things can fall in line with priorities of whoever is making those nominations. And now, in particular, after the ruling from what feels like forever ago, but the immunity ruling, that says that Trump, uh, for actions he takes as like actions qua president, he can never be criminally prosecuted. I think that's just, as one of the justices wrote in dissent, it's just a glaring go for it, from the top court, that he will not meaningfully be subject to review. So I mean, he can just find another strategy if one formally is blocked and his lower officiants won't implement it in a particular way. He'll just find somebody else to do it, or just keep doing it as Vance proposed, and then eventually it will either be upheld or the Supreme Court will handle it in such a way. So I don't have a particularly rosy view of that. I mean, I think the lower courts are doing a pretty heroic job in handling all the challenges and kind of trying to line up what the Trump administration is doing against the law as it currently stands. It's the kind of the higher up you get in the system, the less rosy the picture gets.
Alex?
Yeah, I think those are really smart points. I guess maybe the thing I would throw in here, and take it or leave it, but I think that at some level, like the composition of the pushback on Trump is also very different this time. Like the resistance composition is very, to my mind, like very, very different. And I think that like the sort of elite and powerful institutions in this country have come around to the Trump agenda in a really significant way. And like we've seen that with like the universities, we've seen it with the elite law firms, like we've seen it, and we just see it with like the corporate sector. And I think that like, the first time around they were very quick to like shut off money or to like shut down, channels of influence or whatever. They just didn't want to be seen engaging with this stuff. And this time it's like totally the opposite, where there's a lot of like, to an endearing degree, I think there's a lot of public pushback against, like the ICE raids as they're currently being conceived and executed, and a lot of these policies and stuff. But at the high level, there's just total complicity, and like the money spigot is flowing, and like if you look at even like the corporate donors to like building the ballroom at the White House, like it's just none of these executives have gone to the point of being like, all right, we have to stop putting our name on these Trump things. It's like they still are doing that, and so I think that like, yeah, the notion of impact is, to sort of bring it back around to that, is like I think is informed by that at some level, because I do think that there was more of a sort of like incorporated approach between these sort of elite institutions and the very decorated journalistic entities that exist, like the Times or the Post or whatever, did a lot of awesome work, and it's great. Now I think that's like pretty disaggregated, and like the fact that like Bezos is obviously like a big Trump guy now, and like he's totally in hock to the administration, and also is willing to muddy the reputation of the Post and fuck up the entire operation there in service of this ideological project that he thinks is attendant to Trumpism, obviously at some level. So, um, yeah, I think that that's like an interesting part of it as well. I mean, I think we could probably talk too about the sort of parallel media organizations and that whole environment that they've built up over the course of 8 years, and um, whatever, the collapse of TV and whatever. There are obviously all these things that go into it, but part of me thinks that really it's like, the sort of locus of resistance has really moved down the ladder at some level, and like the elite organizations in this country and leadership in the billionaire class and stuff is like totally in on the Trump administration still. And for that reason, I think we've seen sort of a disconnect maybe that wasn't there the first time around.
Yeah.
I'd also add to that really quickly. This is pre-Trump 2.0, but really specifically on immigration, I think the bigger media organizations kind of failed to meet the moment kind of as soon as Biden took office. I mean, there was like really good immigration reporting, like nitty-gritty immigration reporting coming out of the Times and the Post as well. But in the, opinion sections of some of those papers, and editorials, it was a lot of like buying into border crisis framing kind of from the jump, like kind of from like February 2021. Like the second Biden like took office and did like a couple things, the Republicans started beating the border crisis drum really, really hard. And it's not to say that there were not like crisis level conditions at the border. Like there was a lot of like an unprecedented level of migration in like 2021 to 2023. But at the same time, like there was kind of no interrogation of like why the right had an interest in like calling it a crisis and like fanning the flames of crisis, like the busing of migrants from Texas to New York City that was first like coercive, and then like migrants were like, oh, a free bus to New York, that sounds awesome, I would love to go there. um and I think like this leads us into the Trump era. Like people did like in New York City in particular, like I'm thinking of the first Zohran Mamdani campaign video where he like interviewed people on the street who voted for Trump, like in the Bronx, in Queens, in Brooklyn. And a lot of them were like, yeah, like I don't want my money going to migrants. I don't like this migrant crisis. But like those same people don't necessarily want like militarized ICE raids in their city where they live. And so I think like because so much of elite journalism focuses on elite institutions and like doesn't like understand the dynamics of like what people are thinking and what they want, like it kind of also leads to the Trump administration thinking that they have a mandate on immigration. Like at CPAC, they kept being like, I'm sorry that I keep talking about CPAC, but it was just a very wild experience. And they kept being like, the American public like elected us to do this. Like they want this. And it's like very clear that they don't. Like in all of these cities, like even some people who voted for Trump, like there are stories that are like, oh, I thought it was going to be like newly arrived immigrants. I didn't think it was going to be my neighbor. I didn't think it was going to be my grandma or like the guy at the grocery store. And it's like, well, no, that is who it's going to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I mean, that is a great example of the connection between media and the like media coverage and sustained framings over time and legal issues, which is that like the entire predicate for the Trump administration now invoking so many of the ridiculous powers that they're trying to invoke, especially around immigration and birthright citizenship, is predicated on the idea of a border crisis and that of a supposed invasion. And I mean, they kind of managed to shape the information environment, not just kind of among the man on the street, but ultimately start like the man on the bench of certain courts. So, I do think it's just a good example of kind of how we're seeing the fruits of years of labor and framing across different outlets, including from some kind of like the House conservatives at some of the outlets like the Times.
Wonderful. Um, Shifting slightly, I mean, this deals with some of the sort of like things we've been talking about, but I think you can semi-neatly divide probably both Trump terms into actions that are purely theatrical, all about optics, instilling fear, you know, posing power, those sorts of things. And then there are like the devastating, deeply effective government shifting and warping and destroying things that are sort of happening right on the heels of the optics. And all of it's of course very overwhelming, which I think is a huge part of it. That's like sort of maybe the chief reason why there's just so much of it, and why the optics are important, because they just, you know, serve as a sort of like confusing force. But I wonder how you all think about how to cover those things, whether the media is effective at differentiating between them. And sort of like, you know, I mean, obviously it's been said a million times, Trump is a master media manipulator. And so I think any good journalist has to keep that in mind and try to figure out like how to navigate that and sort of not end up falling for Trump's trap. So I'm just interested in how you guys think about that in your own work, and sort of what you've seen on a larger stage, and how you think that might be, you know, uh, feeding issues, or in some cases maybe remediating them. Do you want to go first, Shawn, or are you still thinking?
I mean, I can say that like there were so many times. I mean, I'm kind of relieved to not be reporting for a little while, because it gives me pause or space to pause and think about what, if anything, I want to be covering next, which is I just remember, especially in like February and March, when then the raids were first kicking off, and like Mahmoud Khalil and then Ramesh Ozturk were a season we were starting to really see kind of the fusion of the theatrics with the with the devastation. That not to kind of fight your schema, but I think that that's one of the
Yeah.
things that was overwhelming me really in February and March, was just like the deluge of things that were both kind of, we keep saying, either unprecedented or just like a significant deviation from like norm, standards, law, whatever. And then like 30 minutes later there would be another one. And so I mean that for me was my central challenge, and I think for most folks in my newsrooms has been like attention, and trying to really drill into like covering the triage, I guess, of what the worst or most impactful thing of that I can cover today has been, versus like being more thorough. So I mean, it has. I think it's just a testament to the the efficacy of the administration and the folks he's surrounded himself with, to kind of like just keep up the pace of devastation. That was largely incoherent, so I'll pass it there.
I thought it sounded very nice. Does anyone else have thoughts?
I have a very brief thought, which is kind of, I guess, like a peek behind the curtain of a time that I fucked up. But I didn't fuck up because we didn't publish it. So in like November, December 2024, I started to write this kind of like, here's what mass deportations are going to look like explainer. And I'm so glad we didn't publish it, because I was like, this is going to be bad, but like it's not going to be as bad as not as bad as we think. But I was like, there's like, they can't ramp it up this quickly. Like it's going to be this like, they're going to have these theatrical raids, but it's going to be like a slower process, and you can't deport people. They have to have here. It was like this whole thing where I was like, this is how the legal system functions, and it's already bad, but like, like it's not going to be what they're saying. And I'm so glad we didn't publish it, because it has been what they're saying. Like, I just didn't expect a lot of, like, I didn't expect, asylum seekers to get rearrested during their hearings. Like, that's not something that, like, I thought was, like, within the realm of possibility, like, as somebody who has been covering immigration for a long time. Because I was just like, well, there's the legal process. Like, even if the legal process is, like, inherently flawed, and, like, designed to, like, keep out as many people as possible, like, there's still a process. And I think the biggest difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2 is a lot of these processes have kind of been thrown out the window.
Yeah, I yeah, there's a lot about this that I think is really interesting. And Shawn, to your point about like how they were using ICE detention in general, I like spent some time in Louisiana and did a couple of stories from down there where they were holding all the majority or all of those students who were swept up in the, the anti-Palestine protest crackdown, and was in those facilities down there. So I found that stuff to be super fascinating. And you know, be happy to talk about that more later. Just for the sake of the question, though, what I think is like really interesting to me is yeah, there's this sort of difference, at least in the reporting that I've been doing recently. And I was just in Los Angeles for this story I did for Slate, and um, spent a lot of time sort of like effectively following ICE around in the South Bay of LA. And there obviously is this notion that we have of these really flashy raids that they've been doing, and they're, they are doing that. That is like, they've done like outlandish stuff, like stuff that you would never think is possible. And, they do like a sort of mass kettling basically, or they run through and get hundreds of people in one go. But like what's happened in Los Angeles over the course of like the summer into the fall, like after they traipsed the Marines through and did the whole big shock and awe thing, is that they've settled into this state of affairs where it's like you just have a bunch of unmarked cars with no license plates driven by guys wearing masks. Um, and they're just basically like effectively terrorizing like poor and brown people all over LA in places where they know that they work, like car washes and Home Depots and 7-Elevens and stuff like that. And what it actually looks like is that there's really like no rhyme or reason, and they don't really even care that much if they're out of status or undocumented. They're just like trying to get arrest numbers up. So they'll like descend on these places and they wait to see if someone runs. That's the whole argument for like probable cause is just like if they show up and someone runs, their running is evidence of their guilt, or at least enough to arrest them. And so they'll arrest people. They take them down to central booking, and then they sort it out later. And if you can prove that you're in status, then eventually you'll get out. And if you can't prove it, well, then you either sit in detention forever, or you get deported. It's just like, but the result of that is that like there are people, tons of people now who are in status, who are like permanent residents or they're citizens, and they're just poor. And the result of that is just that they're chasing poor people around and locking them up, and like just making life as difficult as possible for them. And that's actually like a real like meaningful part of what this thing has become, is just if you like live in your truck and you're Latino, it's just basically open season on you. And they don't care if you're in status or not. They'll arrest you, they'll take you down, they'll process you. And best case scenario, you get out. Well, they're not going to bring you back to where they picked you up. They just let you go. And then it's like, all right, did your truck get stolen? Like, did you manage to lock the truck before you got detained? Because probably you didn't. They don't let you do that. And so like I think the way it's actually settled in is it's different, and it's exceedingly cruel. And it also has like a totally different valence where it's like they're not hitting these record deportation numbers, but they are hitting arrest numbers, but because they're arresting people who are not out of status. It's like it's part of this whole thing. So yeah, and that's like a hard thing to visualize because it's so small bore and it happens just routinely, but it is sort of in that gap between like what's flashy, what's sort of like headline grabbing, and how this thing is actually sort of played out.
Yeah. Yeah, and speaking for myself, the military beat is a unique one because pageantry is so important. And so like, so much of what we see is optics. And I think because of that, there is often a tendency for the media to downplay it. And because in the second Trump administration, a lot of what the DoD has done is very sort of like flashy and on its face ridiculous. It hasn't received that much attention. So like, there's Trump giving like Trump has spent this administration um really fixating on ingratiating himself with the military through these different sort of opportunities, these different pageants. He goes to West Point for the commencement speech. He jokes that they all like look like male models. Ha ha ha. The media kind of like, you know, shrugs it off. He does the military parade. There was like a little bit of concern for a moment in the media about that, like, oh my God, we've turned into communist China. But once it's like not exactly, it's not like a exact sort of like replication of those dynamics. Everyone sort of thinks it's not a big deal, and like the military remains independent. Hegseth calls every flag officer from across the world for his big speech. Again, a bit of like worry in the press, but then when it turns out the subject of Hegseth's remarks is basically just like grooming standards and misogyny. Again, there's sort of like um, not much weight placed on the piece. Whereas, like as I see it, especially in this world that is so like strictly hierarchical, and where there's sort of like this like mythos, and especially around the commander in chief and that hierarchy, these all to me feel like very substantial steps in sort of like capturing, sort of creating a cult of personality within the military. Um, and it is optics. And so again, like it sort of speaks to your point earlier, Shawn, that they are sort of fusing, and maybe that's part of the reason why it's so difficult to untangle. Um, and I mean, because I just don't think anyone's really like succeeded at sort of, I don't know, like covering the news in a way that pierces. Like you can sort of you can maybe sort of like muffle some of that noise, but it is still like effective, I think, even in our own work. And partly because there's a certain level of um, inanity to it all, and sometimes even like humor or comedy. Like these are things that sort of like further obscure the impact or sort of like divert the audience. I find it very difficult to sort of like navigate through.
Jasper, why do you think Hegseth is held on? Like I feel like in Trump one that guy was so doddering or whatever that he would have definitely lost that job. And you've obviously done a bunch of great reporting on him, and it seemed like for a second he was maybe dead to rights there, but he has hung on pretty spectacularly. It seems like. I'm curious why you think that is.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think he shares many fatal flaws with Donald Trump, and Trump sort of sees a kindred spirit in him. Like my big thing was always, my bet was always that if Hegseth kept drinking out of control, that Trump would dump him because Trump does not drink and he doesn't respect alcoholics. So I was sort of like, well, he'll catch like Hegseth like slumped over a table in the Pentagon one morning and boot him. But either like Hegseth has kept his drinking under control, or Trump is just like so enraptured by the idea of like my generals and having his big, strong military boys. Like he has a very adolescent view of the military. He went to military school for 5 years, 5 very foundational years, where he sort of like adopted the trappings of this world. A lot of this is I examined in my book, which is about basically how the military shapes American masculinity. It's for pre-order. It's called God Forgives Brothers
Yeah,
Don't.
when's it out, dude? When's it out?
Memorial Day. But
There you go.
um but yeah, so that's kind of my read. I don't know. I mean, I do think too there was like a much darker element here where Trump understands that the only path to maintaining power, should he wish to extend his stay at the White House beyond 2028, is to have the military on his side. And so, I mean, there's no one better than Hegseth to help in that mission. He is so, unquestionably loyal. Excuse me. We're gonna enter the Q&A period shortly. I'm just gonna ask one more question of the panelists before we get to that. And this is kind of related. It basically, focuses on like, I mean, we've sort of talked about the obfuscation, like how, Trump is very adept at distraction. But then the administration is also clearly like clamping down on the media, intimidating journalists, I mean, Trump has been fantasizing for many years about overturning New York Times versus Sullivan, which is the landmark Supreme Court case that basically like sets very high standards for libel and defamation. Basically, at this point, theoretically, Shawn, tell me if I'm wrong, a journalist can only really like be found legally liable if they have like intentionally lied in one of their reports. They have like actively ignored the truth. They have sort of like, is that right?
So without doing too much law school stuff, and without giving too lawyerly of an answer, it depends. But
God damn it.
it's fine. No, I mean that is kind of what's fascinating is one of the reasons. I mean, I literally wrote in my law school application essay like about what Donald Trump said on the campaign trail in a decade ago, which is that he wanted to open up the libel laws. Um, one of the things we're seeing right now is he didn't really need. I think maybe he and his uh, stable of ridiculous lawyers are realizing that they don't need to change anything about libel law if there are other levers that they can pull on where they can file a ridiculous however many billion-dollar suit against CBS News, and then it turns out they can just extract a settlement based off of a theory that is legally laughable and eminently winnable. I mean, that wasn't even a libel case. It was like a consumer protection lawsuit. So I mean, what we're seeing, I think, is a admirable creativity that a lot of like movement lawyers who thought up kind of the ways of using law in creative ways. Maybe not to that. I guess I was starting. Maybe my answer was starting to sound like I was blaming movement lawyers for their legal creativity of Trump, but which is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that we're seeing
Classic lawyerly language from Shawn, trying
not
to stay on point, not
anyway. I think what we're seeing is just again an embrace of like when you've got all these different levers, pull them all and just see and just see what happens. Like forget whether the law is on your side, forget whether your lawsuit makes any sense to begin with. If you can get a capitulation and a check on the other end of doing it, why not at least try? And so I mean that is kind of what a lot of the media bar is talking about right now is that we're really seeing the like the informal mechanisms that you can't do much about whether like other folks in like whether another outlet will capitulate to a facially ridiculous thing. So I mean that's it's I don't know. It's a weird time to be in media law, I'll say.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a great background on sort of where we stand. And I mean, I don't know if has anyone here like felt that pressure yet in any way, latently or otherwise?
About getting sued.
Yeah, about getting sued or sort of like feeling, I don't know, just a bit more tenuous.
Yeah, I think a little bit. Yeah, I mean, I think the funny thing with, yeah, I felt that maybe a little bit more with ICE and like DHS. Like there are a bunch of rules with them that like I wasn't even really aware of when I started out reporting on them, and like there were certain accommodations that had to be made to like the final published copy on at least one of the stories I did from Louisiana because there were there were concerns. And I don't know that I'd gotten a ton of that before. They haven't done any real. I mean, I haven't been aware of any like real flashy cases that have been brought. At least not it's late. We haven't seen any of that, but maybe like the paywall is too high and they don't know what's going on. Um, but yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know. Gabby, do you have a
Do anything, guys?
I mean, I have not really since June, I've barely been reporting. I've been living in the world of the 1890s to the 1930s, which is both like a really beautiful break from everything that's going on and also like a harrowing reminder that everything is cyclical and yeah. But I have had not really fear of like repercussions from the government, but because I work at a tech website that is very critical of extremely wealthy tech people, I have some concerns about litigious billionaires, and that has made me extremely careful.
Yeah. Yeah, from my experience, one thing that happens now, and this is, I think, I receive this treatment because I'm a freelancer. Every time I send questions to the Department of Veterans Affairs or the Department of Defense, the FLAC, the spokesperson immediately asks to be connected with my editor. I give the Flack, my editor's information because I'm like identifying myself as a freelancer. And then they write nasty emails to my editors trying to basically cancel and kill the story and like, cast me as a socialist stooge. So like that's just sort of like a thing I've gotten used to, and thankfully it hasn't actually like resulted in any, lost work or anything. The reason I was thinking about it, I mean, obviously there's like these high profile examples. I had another crazy story when I tried to cover Trump's commencement speech at West Point, and I've been writing this book that's critical of West Point. West Point has been dealing with my public records requests. They have not been answering them, Shawn, by the way, for years. So maybe, it is what it is. Okay. Um, but I tried to secure credentials to the speech. West Point knew I was going to be there. They rejected them at the last minute, and then I was there anyways, just like for the protest on the outside of campus. And somehow, like 4 days later, I was driving home to Vermont, and my brother called, and he was like, "There's a Secret Service agent here looking for you. Do you want to speak to him?" And I was like, "Okay." So then I like talked to the Secret Service agent. He tells me that West Point has reported me to the Secret Service for acting suspiciously at the commencement and like asking around to speak with the president, which I like was not doing at all. Um, but they had the car I was driving, the plate number, all of this shit. And I mean, it was basically like I took it. It wasn't that spooky. Like I think they were just trying to screw with me, and I mean, there's a bit of intimidation there. Like it didn't go anywhere, thankfully. But um, maybe I just asked that question so I could tell that story. Anyways, I think we're getting to the question and answer portion here. So if you haven't asked your questions, throw them in the chat and someone will curate them. We have one question here um, that reads, maybe this is beyond the scope of this conversation, but are we headed toward a post-literate age? Will people still read long-form journalism in a decade? Should we all become TikTokers? This is particularly pressing to me as a college student pondering post-grad plans. So, does anyone have any thoughts there?
Um, I'll say that when I was in high school, I told my like world history teacher I wanted to be a journalist. This was like 2010 maybe, and he was like, "Oh, don't do that. Newspapers are dying." And he was right, so I didn't study journalism. And then I became a journalist anyway. And a lot of the newspapers died. That's not true. I mean, that's not wrong, but some people still read long form journalism. When I feel especially like things are especially grim, I think that it's going to become kind of like opera or ballet, something to only be enjoyed by wealthy old people. Um, yeah, sorry, that's not a happy answer, but I will resist the TikTokification of journalism for as long as I can because I don't want to be doing that. That sounds miserable.
Yeah,
I will.
I would love to be part of a Baroque art form. I don't know. I mean, with the I don't like I'm not like a Luddite, but I don't watch a lot of short form stuff. But I know that a lot of that content universe kind of still ultimately comes from the long form journalism itself. I mean, the stuff that does happen to reach me, and this is just a product of my algorithm, is like look at what the video is like, a green screen of somebody's head in front of in front of like snippets of an article that's from one of our outlets or the Times or the Post. So I mean, I think it's just uh very much part of a vector for a lot of the same information and still needs it. I mean, to Alex's point, this administration has clearly gotten the memo that they can bypass that information stream entirely by just bringing libs of TikTok on an ice like on an ice raid or things like that. So I mean that in itself might change the mechanics and make some of the short form video in particular some of the more originator, but I think they like a lot of that for that content to have for that content to exist, there needs to be some basic information. And also that's funny that my video cut out at exactly that time.
Dude, it's the NSA coming for
Probably
you.
probably.
Taking out an intercept guy. Wouldn't be the first time. All right. I will personally say that I'm hopeful, maybe delusionally so, but I think there's going to be a huge backlash to AI and all of the like warped false information that it provides. I know everyone says it's going to get much better and soon it's going to be able to do everything. But I don't necessarily believe that. I think the history of Silicon Valley is over-promising and under-delivering. And I just think that like when people, you know, interact with this service, whether it's like um, a Google search or like just some like basic question to a chatbot, the level of degradation that of information they are provided, I think just is clear to anyone. And so I think that information will actually increase in value, like good, solid information. And none of these like chatbots will be able to like ever collect information out into the world, which is where information originates. Like yes, they can like scrub the internet, but really that's just taking off like one or two steps from a Google search. I think that people, I mean, again, this is very optimistic or like relatively optimistic. I just don't think that um we are headed for an age of post-literacy. I can go to the next question unless you want to add anything, Alex.
Oh, not really. I mean, we've all been through, we like lived through one pivot to video already, right? Like I think things are pretty like dire and bad and it's hard to read and the shit is insanely addictive and like I get all that, but it's like I don't, there was already one moment of total consensus that it was all going to video and it didn't really work out. So, and if you personally read, that's pretty much all you can do, right? So that's a good start and you know, hopefully it hangs around.
Cool. Next question. Given the level of capitulation from the legacy media outlets, how can folks like y'all amplify the voices of not just the resistance, but also the voices of the average appalled everyday citizen? For example, do you think that the No Kings protests have gotten anything like the attention they deserve? Or to look at it from another direction, how about the stories of the families and neighbors whose lives have already been ruined by the push to deport the people who actually make America great, i.e., migrant workers? Um, okay. Yeah, I mean, one thing I will just say right off the bat is I think that, um, I think that the sort of coverage this person is describing around, um, local No Kings protests and, everyday citizens reacting and absorbing Trump's policies, I think those are the sorts of stories that thrive and have incredible impact on the local level. Like if you can just sort of, in some ways I think that the massive 2 million person protest of the No Kings rally in New York or whatever that's like blasted across ABC News isn't necessarily like the most effective form of like showing resistance and solidarity. I mean, it holds some power, though. That image, similar images like that have been just like circulating now for years, including during the George Floyd protest, which was the largest mass movement in world history and accomplished very little. So I think what's important personally is to see like on the local level neighbors, people whose like issues and whose activism can be tied to local matters. I think that's how you start to understand these movements and you know obviously there's not local news everywhere. There should be more of it, and that's a huge part of that's a huge accelerant for all of I think these issues that we've been discussing tonight. Um, but yeah, I mean, and like similar to, you know, the stories about a migrant worker who's deported, like I think some of the most powerful things that have pierced through on that topic, and maybe I mean, I haven't paid super close attention to it, have been like those really personal stories about a community that are on an interpersonal level. I don't know if people have additional thoughts there. I can also move on to the next question if unless people want to talk more about it.
I have a quick thought or two. One is that like there are local publications who are doing, I think, really good work on a lot of this. Like in New York, Documented, for example, is like so good at reporting on not just immigration at the policy level, but like immigrant communities throughout the city and like reporting like for those communities as well. And then on the subject of capitulation by legacy media outlets, I think another important point that kind of speaks to or ties into the rest of the conversation is like not taking the administration at their word. Like with, you know, the university students who were arrested by ICE and in some cases had their student visas rescinded. Like, if you believe the administration's line on that, it's like they are providing material support for terrorism and therefore they are going to be deported. Um, and I think like reporting on the protests to free those students, like the encampments at Columbia and other universities, or I mean, like kind of like how things like the No Kings protests, but other like more militant actions have like been weaponized by the administration as like proof of like a big Antifa plot. Like there are currently prosecutions happening at the state and federal level of like just massive dragnets of protesters, some of whom like did things that are maybe allegedly illegal, and then some of whom were just like there or like know these people or are alleged to have known these people. Like if you take like I think part of reporting on like the everyday citizen is like how more and more people are getting swept up in the surveillance dragnet and how like a lot of the technology that is first used against migrants is now being used against like American citizens, some of whom are dissenting and some of whom are just like there.
Yeah. One other thing, sorry to take up space, but you know, something really interesting that occurred during the anti-war movement during Vietnam is that because of good coverage that was humanizing to activists and was holistic about the war and its flaws and the president, is that public support then trickled into the courtroom. Like there was not only the Chicago Seven that saw its charges dropped after the DNC, but there were like scores of other bands of protesters who were arrested and tried in their communities. Like there was like the Toledo Seven. A lot of this is really expertly chronicled in Howard Zinn's People's History. And what happened in those cases were grand juries just refused to charge them. And we've seen some of that in DC. I mean, when the National Guard came into DC um, and was sweeping people up and giving them bogus charges, there were grand juries that were just dropping the cases. And so I think like just having that sort of coverage that's really like locally based and humanizing and sort of like just puts it out there straight can be super effective at like mitigating this legal crackdown.
Also, just to like plug magazine journalism specifically, it's like this is the medium, obviously all of us write for magazines, so we're biased in that sense, but like doing like character driven stuff or like narrative stuff or anything that's like longer burn, like the magazines are the places that allow you to do that. And I think that's probably why a lot of us are drawn to those outlets as writers, but also I think that's why they play a really important role for, you know, readership and all this stuff too. So Support the mags.
Absolutely. Okay, a couple more questions. So one actually concerns one viewer wants to know more, Alex, about your experience in Louisiana. And I think that's, it's a really fascinating story in part because there was sort of like all of this initial coverage about Mahmoud Khalil, and then he was just sort of like, ferried off into this no man's land. And I think that like your work there, other people's work, just sort of keeping the pressure on the administration and sort of like exploring the sort of essence itself of how the Trump administration has been disappearing people really is like a really powerful template of how to sort of, respond to some of what the Trump administration is doing. So if you want to give maybe like a quick uh, overview of why you wanted to go down to Louisiana and what you found there.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting one too because a lot of the infrastructure that's been built for immigrant detention and ICE detention specifically, like happened at the very end of Trump one. So 2019 was his big year in Louisiana. Louisiana is the second largest state right now for immigrant detention after Texas, which is insane, of course, because it's not a border state, right? It's like doesn't even have a very big immigrant population. And there are nine ICE detention centers in Louisiana. There's a 10th just across the border in Mississippi that's was until very recently the biggest ICE detention center in the country. Um, and so it's like, it's this place, it's in the middle of nowhere. It's like central Louisiana, so it's so far from urban centers, it's so far from resources, so far from national attention, right? National reporters and everywhere else. And um, near impossible to get a lawyer, near impossible to get a translator. It's like if you get sent down there, you're basically gone. And what's fascinating about that is that like that whole infrastructure was stood up, as I said, 2019. We saw a lot of these places. A lot of them were jails and prisons that had been closed because of abuse allegations that they couldn't keep open. Then they got spun off to private prison companies, and then they got contracts from the feds to reopen as ICE centers. ICE relies massively on private prison contractors, which has proven to be one of actually the limiting reagents for the whole thing. Is that these companies are primarily interested in generating value for stockholders, which has actually slowed down some of the growth and has made them a little bit more ineffective, actually. But it's a fascinating place because it's so far out of visibility, and so um, it's when I was down there, I found it to be like pretty it's pretty fascinating. It's shocking. It's one of these things. There's so little oversight that, like prisons in this country, there are horrible places, right? Like the amount of abuse that happens in the federal prison system is shocking. There's way more oversight on in the federal prison system than there is with an ICE detention center. Just it's not even close. And with immigration court, it's the same thing. Like all the rules are made up. Like these are often employees of DHS get promoted to be judges and rule dispassionately on these cases. It's like the whole thing is kangaroo court to the extreme. And so um yeah, the time that I spent down there, I thought it was really eye-opening. It was like, this is very much a vision of like law enforcement where it's just like total, it's just, there are no rules, there's no regulations, there's no oversight. And the result is that you have like these clusters of prisons in the middle of nowhere, and they have 70 people per dorm room. There are no pillows, the lights are on 24 hours a day, it's freezing cold. Um, and people just get stuck there. It's like there are only two ways out. You either get deported or you get stuck there. And like that's a story you hear over and over and over again. And that's the template, and now they're building out obviously massively this infrastructure across the country, but where it's happened first, the place that's like the most important right now for that is in Louisiana. And there's a whole backstory on that too. But yeah, fascinating place, really important for the Trump administration's ambitions on a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, I'll try to put the story in the chat, or you can if you have a sec, Alex.
Yeah, sure.
All right. Well, I think we probably only have time for one more question, unfortunately. Thank you all so much for the many good questions that I wish we could answer. But I'm I'm going to end on a high note with a question that asks how we remain positive and or safe in this environment. Um, and I guess, yeah, maybe like I would ask you each to sort of think to note how you're sort of thinking about the future, what you're focused on moving forward. Um, and we can start with you, Shawn, as always.
Um, yeah, how do I say? I'll say I'll start with safe, I guess, rather than positive. I don't know. I mean, I kind of looked at my colleagues and the people who are on this call. I say both co colleagues like who work in my immediate newsrooms, and also just across the broader ecosystem. We could be doing something else. But we don't. And so kind of whenever I think that what is any of this worth continuing to fight on the legal front or cover these horrific things on the coverage front, I just kind of look at other people and the backbone that they have, as well as the folks who uh, had to give up so much to get like to be able to do the same thing. So I mean, I really just kind of draw on solidarity more than anything else. And then also to what Gabby said, I think when she was talking about the cyclicality of things, I try to think about the longer arc, and kind of I see a lot of our role as creating a historical record, hopefully for another time when there will be accountability, and maybe when some of our legal and constitutional mechanisms will actually work as or will be changed to work. Um, so solidarity and historical gaze.
Gabby?
Well, that was a really good answer, Shawn. I would say there's a bunch of different ways that I try to stay positive on the safety front. I love the website Delete Me. Scrub your information, make sure nobody can find your mom's house. Sorry, that's like a very practical one, but that one's really important to me. Shout out to Delete Me. And I don't know, just like I've spent a lot of this year thinking about like, do I need to scrub my phone before international travel? I wrote about this. The answer is yes, and you should all do it too. There is an explainer on theverge.com. Yeah, just like practical things to not get yourself into situations where like innocuous things can be used against you is kind of huge. Staying hopeful. I think there are so many people doing so much good work in the face of like extreme repression, and I'm like but a tiny little drop in that bucket. And then to kind of steal slash piggyback off of Shawn's answer and also talk about the 1890s again, sorry. I've been reading a lot of newspapers from the time that I'm writing about. And like, I know I keep saying this, but it's all the same. Literally, like 1896 newspapers, like, we're thinking about the colonization of Palestine. And I'm like, oh, okay, like things are just cyclical. And like, that's not to say that things are okay, but it's just like, we're all just doing our part for the historical record, as Shawn said.
Alex?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I'll probably say the same thing as you guys, but yeah, I don't know. When I was in Los Angeles doing this recent story that I did for Slate about like a group of people who are just like monitoring ICE and it's like a civilian group that is doing counter intel effectively on ICE and subverting some of the raids. Found that to be like incredibly inspiring, just being around those people. And it's like our rights are like incredibly curtailed, and there are so few things you can do. Like there's so little accountability for ICE specifically right now, and like you can't intervene, you can't touch them, you can't follow them, you can't there's a bunch of stuff you can't do. And it is amazing actually how greatly our rights have been abrogated at some level. But by the same token, like there are people who are just, truly everyday people who are out there and are like, no, just like refusing to to just take it lying down, and I think that's really sick. I found it to be really motivating when people are just like, all right, like fuck this, no way. Like and there's a lot you can do still, despite all that bad stuff. And yeah, I don't think it's like I don't think it's like all over. I think that there's like there are opportunities. People are very creative. And I think that I don't know. There was a moment when after the election where it seemed like everyone was gonna, wanted to fall in line, and we saw this like Democratic politicians too, where they were like, Trump's got the mandate. It's like we just got to go along with it, and it's like that hasn't really happened in a cool way. So could have been way worse. It could still get way worse, but I don't know. I feel like I've seen some like pretty heartening, cool stuff along the way. So.
Wonderful. Well, I don't think I can top any of those eloquent answers. So I think at this point I'm going to wrap up the conversation. I want to thank all of our panelists tonight, Gaby, Shawn, and Alex, as well as Brennan and Chris, and the Ellsberg Initiative for Peace and Democracy at UMass Amherst. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Despite many of us doing delete me in some form or another, most of us are easily available online if you're looking to follow up with questions via email or on Twitter or elsewhere, LinkedIn. So we hope to hear from you all, and thanks again for a wonderful evening. Bye.
Thanks.